All right, hello. I'm hoping you can hear me. Kayli, can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. Kia ora everyone, my name's Rhema Vaithianathan and welcome to the launch of a newly formed collective called...
Can't hear anything.
Oh, you can't hear anything? All right.
I can hear you fine.
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Oh, thanks,
Rhema.
Alex. Okay,
Yeah.
Nan, it's just you.
It was all right before.
We're doing a democratic approach where we just, the majority can hear me, we're on. So thank you so much for joining us for this newly formed collective, which we have called Stop Sexual Harassment on Campus. And my name's Rhema Vaithianathan, and I'm hoping, and thank you so much for taking an Friday evening for the rest of the country, from going out to dinner and having a good time, for Aucklanders from staying in another room in your house. I know you probably all spent the whole day in the same seat you're sitting in now. I certainly have. So thank you so much for making the time. And we're really excited to have a great lineup of speakers today, and also to share with you a little bit what we've been thinking as a group and why we initiated this. So about us. So we basically, the idea of SHOCK, Aotearoa, which is Stop Sexual Harassment on Campus, is we're just a collective. We're not anything more fancy than that, of academics, students and staff who are committed to a better way for dealing with and preventing sexual harassment and gender-based violence in Aotearoa, New Zealand universities. And so today we're launching officially the society, the collective, the movement, the kaupapa, and we hope that this will be a journey that many of us can share. You can get on sometimes, get off sometimes. You can have a debate about it, because at the end of the day, if universities can't, through open, transparent debate, address this issue that we're steeped in at the moment, I think it's very, it behoves badly for democracy and social justice and so on. So I think transparency is the key to our kaupapa, and openness is the key as well. So we're an open, inclusive society and collective that want to share with anyone who wants to share with us. So it was sort of initiated by me. I'm Rhema Vaithianathan. I'm a professor in economics at Auckland University of Technology and also at University of Queensland. And to be honest, I did my PhD in New Zealand. I'm a 2000 PhD. So you can imagine how long I've been in the university system. And I've been, for much of that, a bystander in what I've seen happening to many of my colleagues, unfortunately, many of my female colleagues and some of my male colleagues, which is a pattern of behavior that I really think was completely unacceptable. But because I had sort of grown up in this culture and in this environment, because I did my PhD here, because I've been at, universities in Australia, came back to New Zealand, I had never stopped and thought, how acceptable is this kind of behavior that I'm witnessing? And thanks to really Ali Mao's reporting in stuff on some of the really egregious happenings in my own university, I suddenly stopped and took stock and thought, oh my God, this is really, I have been standing by in what is a train wreck and never doing anything. And suddenly I realized that out of me came this huge anxiety to do something, to not just sit there and share with my colleagues and my friends just how terrible things were, but I thought we really need to move the dial. We need to make a difference. And I actually naively thought that it wasn't so difficult. Now I'm glad I've got the likes of Nicola, Gaston and Susie Wiles and amazing scientists on this kaupapa, because I think it's not rocket science. It's actually a hell of a lot harder than that. So it is actually a very difficult problem to crack. So what are we what have we as a collective? We have representatives from all 8 universities, plus representatives from my colleagues at University of Queensland, who are sort of a watching brief on the other side of the Tasman to see if this movement can take purchase and therefore be replicated in Australia. So we've had meetings, Zoom meetings over months now, and we've sort of come up with 4 putative issues that we think are interesting and useful to address in the next few years. Of course, we realize that an agenda of fixing a system that maybe took 100 years to build to the levels that we've seen today is not going to be solved in a few years. So we've really tried to find 4 really issues that we think, if we as a community address today, might be help us move some way towards the solution. And one of them is that the obvious problem and flaw in a system around sexual harassment, bullying, which is complaint-based, is that almost all of us agreed that almost every single person we had seen make a complaint was worse off for having made the complaint. So we are relying on a system of justice, on a system of data generation, a system that is supposed to correct itself, where at the heart of it relies on victims making complaints, but on the heart of it knows and has known for decades that people who make complaints are made worse off. And that is intolerable, and it is why the system is broken, because never in a million years will smart people who see the terrible things that happen to complainants, unless they have an amazing bank of emotional resilience. And I have to give my hats off to some of my colleagues who do have that amazing emotional resilience I would never have unless they have that, and money in the bank for lawyers, and a whole bunch of colleagues who are supportive, and they're really not going to go down that route. So that's one of the things that we're really thought we need to fix. The second thing that comes out of that broken system is the lack of consequence for perpetrators. The lack of consequence for perpetrators is aggravated by the fact that even when consequences slowly over months, over years start creeping up on perpetrators, they always have the ripcord of changing universities. And we know amongst ourselves in our committee many cases where, when that final kind of attempts of complainants to make a complaint come to fruition after so many hurdles, and they finally start getting some purchase, people leave the university and move to other ones. The fourth really egregious thing, which is not the thing to address on its own. Getting rid of NDAs is never going to solve this problem, but surely the existence of NDA is a symptomatic of a deep-seated problem, which is universities who, at the end of the day, our commitment is to transparency and truth as the pillar of social justice, has decided that they will silence potential victims and survivors by giving money or whatever conditions to signing an NDA. So we don't think that NDAs are off the table, but we do think NDAs need to be reviewed. So what we want are 4 things: regular national climate surveys. If we can get up in such short notice this huge behemoth called the PBRF that every 5 years goes and does something that a simple Google Scholar could do in a minute. The fact that we have built this huge thing called PBRF to try to measure every single person's research impact means that we are able to measure things. And if we are able to measure research, we can measure the climate, we can measure the level of bullying, we can measure the level of harassment. So we want a regular commitment by the university sector to a regular national climate survey. We want also a national independent body to handle complaints. We are sick of waiting around to think that universities are going to solve this problem on their own, because of the high level of competition that unfortunately we have placed our university systems in. And I have a lot of sympathy to that. They are not necessarily they're not necessarily attracted to these competitive models, but that is what they find themselves in. As they become more and more competitive, fighting over smaller and ever receding amounts of research funding, they are forced to have to try to adopt some kind of more corporate methods to try to protect their own brand, as they now call it. And that has put them in a very invidious position of having to address these really unfortunate things happening within their boundaries whilst trying to maintain their brand. So I think at the end of the day, a collective national independent body is what SHOC has proposed. We also think a register of NDAs is valuable, and we also want to see a lot more preventive strategies. To be honest, many of us have never been trained on how to work with colleagues, what sexual harassment means, what bullying is, none of these. There's no leadership coaching, nothing. So what you could do is sign our open letter and see the chat box for details. Follow us on SHOC Aotearoa and sign up for updates. So just a bit of housekeeping. Please note that media is present at this public forum. This is a public forum. Everyone was invited, and so please conduct yourself accordingly. Please also note that we're recording this, and the recording will be publicly shared. Questions for the Q&A section will only be seen by the host, which is Kayli, who will ask the questions on your behalf, and you can ask to be anonymous, otherwise she will mention who you are. Please note that some of the content of today's talk and panel discussion might be triggering for you, and there are multiple support options. You could call Safe to Talk, Victim Support, Rape Crisis, and Lifeline, and we urge you to do that and to exit if you feel that this is triggering. So for the next 20 minutes, we're going to hear from 3 of our panel members. We'll then have time for Q&A, where you can pop your questions into the chat box for panelists. I'm not a panelist. The panelists are much more eminent than me and able to answer your questions. And then we'll spend a few minutes on wrap up and next steps. So the speakers that we've got today are part of our committee, and also because they have a very high profile and have prosecuted this agenda for much longer than I have, and are much more the correct people to talk to us about what they see as the challenges and what they see as the way forward. So we will have Nicola Gaston, who is an associate professor and co-director of the McDermott Institute, past president of the New Zealand Association of Scientists, and author of Why Science is Sexist. We also are thankful to have Angela Wanhalla from University of Otago and Kaitahu, who researched sexual violence, gender, race, and colonialism in Aotearoa, and Kayli Taylor, who leads student-led sexual violence prevention. So with that, I will hand the speaking over to Nicola. If you wouldn't mind, Nicola, unmuting Nicola, and I'll mute myself and stop sharing.
Kia ora koutou. E noho ana o ki Tamaki Makoro, ko Nicola Gaston, tōku ingoa, no reira tēnā koutou katoa. So I'm a bit embarrassed by the introduction from Rhema, who is really the leading light behind everything that we've managed to do so far. I'm assuming that everyone can hear me. Good, there's a nod, that's helpful. One should never really assume on a Zoom call. And so I'm here as Rhema said, I'm in physics at the University of Auckland, and so I'm here as an academic. I'm the co-director of the McDermott Institute, which is a centre of research excellence. And I guess I have spent a bit of time in different institutions in New Zealand, which is maybe relevant. I worked once upon a time at a CRI, Industrial Research Limited. I then worked at Victoria University in Wellington for a few years, and I'm glad to see a few colleagues from Wellington here with us tonight as well. And as Rhema said, I was the president of the New Zealand Association of Scientists, which does have a statement of purpose that encompasses looking after the working environment of scientists and worrying about these kinds of issues. So I wrote Why Science is Sexist in 2014, which seems a long time ago. And I mention that here because I think it's useful to preface what I'm going to say in explaining a couple of the choices that I made in writing that book. So one of the very obvious choices, which I think I sort of made clear in the text, was that I was largely going to exclude any discussion of racism, which was not to say that it wasn't significant, but mostly to say that I wasn't the right person to talk to many of those issues, although in many ways issues of racism and sexism can play out similarly. There are differences. The book was framed as a personal story, really, and so I was not the right person to talk about that. Sexual harassment and assault, the more severe end of sexism, if you like, was something I also very deliberately excluded because of the audience that I wanted to reach, because also I didn't feel I was the right person perhaps to talk to that. And it's something that I've thought about many, many times since. I've reconsidered both of those choices. I've never really regretted either of them, but I have learnt a great deal since. And so in 2016, I volunteered to do an interview about personal experiences of sexual harassment because the person doing the interviewing was somebody I trusted, and I'm not going to talk about that here particularly. Other than to say that, it took me quite a while after having written the book to get to the point where that was something I even felt I had a story to talk about on. And actually, one of the reasons I don't like to talk about it is that I struggle to talk about it, not because I find it personally difficult, but because I actually struggle to talk about it without being flippant and without minimizing what happened. And I would rather not talk about it than do that now, because I think it's something that we do much too easily in addressing the way sexual harassment plays out in our environment. And so I've thought a little bit about this issue of minimization. Why does so much happen and we allow it to keep happening? And one reason that's relevant here, it's not the only reason at all, but it's because we know that this stuff, sexual harassment and assault, racial harassment, gendered harassment, which isn't always sexual in nature, it all happens in other industries as well. And so one of the reasons that I first felt strongly that I wanted to be supportive of what Rhema was trying to do here is that at our first meeting, she framed this for us very clearly. And I know you didn't want this to be about you, Rhema, but I am going to say this because it's something that matters to me. That, if we can fix this in universities, and you could frame that more negatively as, well, if we can't fix this in universities, then what? But let's say it more positively. If we can fix this in universities, we have a chance of learning from that and extending further to fix things in other places. So we're not advocating for something to be put in place so that universities get this right, because universities are a more important workplace than anywhere else. We're not more important than, say, people working in the hospitality industry or on building sites or in hospitals or in MPs' offices or in any other workplace. This is simply an industry in which we actually have some agency, and we should be able to advocate for how to do this right. We have people who have expertise, and thankfully we have Angela here who's going to talk after me, who has more expertise than me on this subject. So I think it's really important that we frame this positively as something that we can do if we figure out the right way to do it. And so figuring it out, I think, as much as we've put out a call for the things we want to change and some of the pathways to making that change happen, I think figuring out how to make this change and how to make it change correctly and to everyone's benefit is still a journey we're all on. And that's one of the real values, I think, in what we're doing here. I guess the other thing I'd just like to say quickly about universities and why it's maybe so important to me that universities get this right is that fundamentally, I think there's something, no, I'd say it more directly than that. I think the primary purpose of a university, really, a publicly funded university, is equity. And I know that that might not be where most people start. Most people think about knowledge and scholarship. But knowledge and scholarship are things that predate the university. Knowledge and scholarship would exist without publicly funded universities. They would just be the preserve of the wealthy, right? If knowledge has value, then value motivates the creation of knowledge. So the key purpose, the core purpose of universities has to be to counteract that tendency for knowledge to be acquired by the powerful and to be weaponized by the powerful. And so I think that the public funding of universities really means that our core purpose, our primary purpose, has to be equity. And so I think we have to get that right. I think we have a chance to actually move the dial on something here. And I think it's really positive that we're in a position to advocate for something that's about all universities in New Zealand, not looking at just the latest one that happens to have had the most recent cases that have ended up in the newspapers. I don't think that's relevant at all. This is about getting it right for all of us, for all staff, all students, all of our universities, and I really, really hope that we can move towards getting that right. So, kia ora.
Kia ora. Thank you, Nicola. Angela, if we would move to you, that would be great. Thank you.
All right, well, he mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Hopefully everyone can hear me. And thank you, Rhema, for putting this together, and Kayli as well. Thank you, Nicola, for that wonderful speech too. But I cannot claim any expertise in this space at all. So, and nor can I be as articulate as both Rhema and Nicola are. So what you might see from me while I'm talking is that I'll be looking slightly to the side because I've written some notes because I want to really cover off a few points too. Oh, good, Nicola's got notes as well. So as Rhema said, I'm Angela Wanhalla. I am at the University of Otago, and I'm an associate professor in history, and I've done a little bit of research dabbling in the history of sexual violence in 19th century New Zealand, particularly looking at the question of race and how Māori women especially were treated in the context of the New Zealand Wars of the 1860s. But I also want to note here that I've been at the University of Otago since 2005, and that is my first academic job, my only academic job. So unlike Nicola, I haven't moved around. So my only experience really is of Otago, and really I've been a student at the University of Canterbury. So I just wanted to shout out to my supervisor, Professor Katie Pickles, who's part of the SHOP Collective, and I know she's online. I saw her name earlier. To thank her in particular for encouraging me in the work that I've done. So without Katie, I don't think I really have a career, and nor would I really know as much as I do about kind of feminist and post-colonial histories. So Katie, thank you very much. And one of the important things I think about kind of feminist history is that it gives us a great grounding and understanding in how collectives work and can be successful. So it's very exciting to be part of this collective. And so what I'm going to talk about briefly tonight is really more of a launch speech rather than any kind of agenda setting kind of items, because I'm very excited about the existence of this centre and I'm really privileged to be a part of it. So I just want to use this as an opportunity to kind of congratulate Rhema and everyone for making this happen. So one of the reasons I'm here is very personal. And tonight I'm talking as Angela Wanhalla, not Angela Wanhalla as Associate Professor at the University of Otago. I'm talking in a much more personal capacity. I'm here tonight and I'm part of the collective because university culture and academia needs to change. I think we all know this. We're all here online for that very reason. I think we all have our own stories that we could tell about predators, harassers and bullies at university, and the many who got away with it and maybe continue to still get away with it as well. I certainly know that I have many stories, stretching back, way back to starting university in the mid-90s, when you quickly learnt who to stay away from. You quickly got told. When I was a tutor, you know, as a young female tutor, you end up taking on a lot of pastoral care, but without too much training and having to manage and look after and care for students who are dealing with harassment. And I have many, many instances of dealing with those kinds of stories as a tutor. And then when you finally get into academia itself, you find yourself forced into silence because your career depends upon it. Universities are deeply hierarchical structures of power. When you're at the bottom of it, you feel like you have no voice at all. And sometimes you feel like you're stuck at the bottom constantly. So part of the reason I'm part of this collective is because I want to change things. I'm currently on research and study leave, and it's giving me a good opportunity to reflect on what I like about academia and what I don't. And I've been reflecting that if I'm going to stick with academia, then the culture does need to change. I'm in my early 40s. I've probably got another 20 or so years to go as a career. And do I really want to come back to university when it hasn't changed very much at all, hasn't progressed or moved? So I have had some serious doubts over the past couple of years about whether I can carry on anymore. And if I do, and that's a really big if at the moment for me, then I want to participate in positive change through practical solutions. So I can't bear being silent anymore. So like Rhema, I don't want to be that bystander. I want to have a voice in the system, and I want to see it be better for everyone. For me, but also all of our future colleagues that we might work with as well. And all of those postgrad students out there and tutors and casual staff who make up the kind of workforce of the tertiary sector. So it was nice to see New Zealand universities have a statement released in June last year that said that no level of sexual harm or assault is acceptable on our campuses. They set up a joint program, they said to share knowledge, and over the past few years it's been really good to see universities put in place policies, programs, procedures and teams to prevent and respond to instances of sexual harm. And some of them have also resourced educational programs. That's all really fantastic. Now, while I agree that each university has its special character and that each university must find its own path through this issue, we do need something that sits along that joint program, such as an independent body, as Rhema has set out, so that we can measure change, see how universities are responding on a nationwide basis and across the sector. And student voice has to be a part of that as well. So Rhema's and Shock's vision for an independent body that can investigate cases of harassment and bullying is why I'm part of this collective. I really believe in that vision. Now, Shock is not the first group to call for such a body. In June last year, Otago University doctoral students Kayli Stewart and Lily K. Ross, who I hope are online, who researched the prevalence of sexual violence and how best to address it, called for an external oversight body last year. They surveyed, and the reason why they called for that is that they'd surveyed New Zealand university students' sexual experiences and found that 1 in 3 students surveyed had experienced some form of sexual assault, including rape. They pointed out how campus life, the nature of campus life in itself is part of the kind of prevalence of sexual assault and harm. It helps to explain it in particular. So I support their arguments and that of Shock for an independent body to investigate cases, to do research, to conduct regular surveys across the sector, to obtain evidence of the extent of gender-based violence, bullying, harassment, and discrimination of all forms. And if you want to know more about how this body might operate, then you should have a look at the article by Aotearoa that Rhema mentioned, that appeared this morning on Stuff, and also ask questions of Rhema in Q&A, not me, because I think she's got a really kind of clear vision of what that looks like. Now, as a historian who's done research on sexual violence in New Zealand's colonial era, I can say that evidence will be critical for how we understand this particular moment in the future. So that kind of role of that independent body of doing evidence and measuring, doing that climate survey, I think is really critical for what we do next. So researching sexual violence in the colonial past is really hard for several reasons. It's probably, these several reasons are why probably people don't do very much of it. We need more people working on these kinds of areas. One reason is because it is so invisible. Shame meant few people reported it. Survivors also understood that taking a case against a perpetrator would mean being cross-examined in court, sometimes by the perpetrator, and be re-traumatised. But also having their reputation attacked and having to deal with the charge that it was their fault. So some of that sounds very similar to what we see today. They also had to deal with a police force and legal system that did not take domestic or sexual violence seriously, seeing it as a private matter. And if you were Māori, it was even harder to access the system in the 19th century. Yet many women did lay charges and they took perpetrators to court, and I thank them for doing that. So all of these factors cited make it really difficult to measure with any accuracy the extent of sexual violence in our past. But it shouldn't stop us asking questions and looking for answers. So that's why I'm part of Shock, because it's not shying away from asking hard questions and looking for answers. It's doing some really critical and important work in that space. And finally, before I end, I really want to also acknowledge that Shock builds upon the work of many people, such as journalists like Aotearoa and others who've worked hard to bring the stories to light. It hasn't been an easy road for them at all. In addition to the many people within universities who have pushed for diversity, equity and inclusion. I know this has been an enormous challenge and one that is ongoing. Shock wouldn't exist without you, your work and your critical voices, nor the survivors too themselves. So I'm really grateful to Rhema, Kayli, Nicola and everyone else who's really brought Shock into being. Being part of this collective over the past couple of months gives me hope for the future, and it makes me feel that I can be happy going back to work after my RSL has ended, feeling like I might have achieved something actually really worthwhile in the end. So it's been a real honour to speak tonight, to follow Nicola and to also help launch this collective into the world. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Angela. That was wonderful words. And so we'll move to Kayli. Kayli, if you could unmute yourself, since you're also doubling as host and other administrative duties.
Yeah, kia ora koutou. Thank you to Rhema and Nicola and Angela for talking so far. Am I volume good? Lots of thumbs up, very good. I'm probably not going to be as eloquent as Nicola and Angela. I've never talked to a group this large before. So this is exciting and new and terrifying for me. My name is Kayli. I am a third year art student at the University of Otago and I study history. I'm really interested in colonial histories and then decolonial futures, and so how we can learn from the past and construct new and brighter futures. And I'm kind of interested in the systems of power that come alongside this. And I think that the systems of power is kind of how is one lens that you can look at sexual violence on campus through as well. So I'm here in two capacities. I am an administrator for Shock, which means that I send them all emails, incessant emails at random hours of the day. And I'm also involved in student-led sexual violence prevention and advocacy awareness raising movements on campus. I got involved in a movement called Thursdays in Black in 2018. I was a little fresher, and I wanted something to sign up to. It wasn't the last thing I signed up to at university, but it was the first. And so Thursdays in Black is one branch of an international movement that encourages people to wear black on Thursdays to stand in solidarity with survivors of sexual violence. It is a really, really accessible way of doing activism. It's weekly, and it forces you to think about the way you interact with the world on a weekly basis, but without kind of needing to. You don't have to deal with kind of hard topics. You don't have to be a support person, but you can just engage in an easy and accessible form of activism. I've always been passionate in areas of injustice, much to the inconvenience of people around me throughout my schooling. And I've always been keen to find proactive solutions to the problems that we sort of see in society. From a sexual violence perspective, I got involved kind of not with a desire to stay involved for a really, really long time, but just to kind of test the waters of being involved on campus, which became an increasing frustration at university processes around dealing with sexual violence and sexual harassment, and has kind of snowballed into this now. I don't see universities themselves necessarily as being the issue, but I think that sexual violence on campus is the issue. But it will always exist in power imbalances within university hierarchies and within university structures. And I think that there's a degree that universities prioritise their reputation over the lives and experiences of students and staff. And I think that until we can begin to challenge that quite comprehensively, we're never going to see transformative change in this sector. In terms of shock, it's fantastic to me. I think it's the beginning of a kind of collaborative effort between students and staff, and an ability for more connection and more opportunities, and for people to, for students to use the resources that they have, and for staff to use the resources that they have. I think that students are connected on the ground to what's kind of happening, and obviously staff are as well, and staff have fantastic connections and fantastic ability to kind of impact change in the university structure. Thank you all for coming. This is fantastic. We've got an open letter that is in the chat, which I encourage everybody to sign. And also, if you're keen to get involved in shock in the future, there's also another Google form which you can add your skills to, and we can, if you've got skills in media, press releases, or video content, or kind of anything, whatever weird niche skills you have, I'm sure that they contribute to our movement. Thank you all for coming. This movement takes everybody. I want to very, very briefly thank the people in my life who have empowered me and strengthened me. Many of you are in the call, and I'm sure you know who you are. Thank you for listening to me, and thank you for making me cups of tea. And also thank you to the people who put effort in on an everyday basis to these kind of issues, and are good bystanders and good allies and good support people. The collaboration is what makes us all work, and I think it's good that there's this many people kind of pushing for change in this area. So.
Thanks, Kayli. So now we have an opportunity for the audience to ask questions from the panel. Please put it into the chat box, and if you want to ask it verbally, you're welcome to. Otherwise, Kayli can read it out herself. So Kayli, have you started receiving questions in the chat box? Or maybe we need to give everyone a couple of minutes to think about questions.
Yeah, there was one, I'll give people more time as well, but there was a question about kind of the work that we're doing, and whether it's sort of themed around sexual harassment, gender-based violence, discrimination, bullying, kind of what the kind of interests are, or I guess whether those are all the same thing. Does somebody else want to answer the question?
Linda, are you on the call? Linda, do you want to take that? Because I think this was something we discussed a lot originally. And introduce yourself as well, Linda.
Kia ora mai tātou, ko Linda Johnson tōku ingoa. I'm a feminist geographer from geographer from the University of Waikato. I work in the area of thinking about how place impacts through issues of equity, gendered, sexual, race, and so on, homophobia, those issues. So yes, we necessarily didn't want to tie ourselves too tightly to a definition of what kind of harassment and assault and gender-based discrimination might happen on campuses, because we know from other research that there is a great deal of difference for people, victims and survivors. And the other research shows that these are all tend to be connected. We know patriarchy is still alive and well. We know homophobia still happens, transphobia, and these impact in a number of ways that can't be delimited into one kind of classification. So we've deliberately kept our remit broad so that we can collect the stories, collect the experiences, understand what's going on campus, and call for transformative change, as we've heard from the speakers tonight.
Thank you, kia ora, Linda. Kayli, do you want to chuck in another question?
Yes. So we've got a question about the immediate future plans for SHOC and what we plan on doing, I guess, from here.
Yeah, so we've drafted that open letter, which we're hoping many people will sign. After that, the plan is to send that to the chancellors and vice chancellors and systematically meet with each of those folks where we can and where they'll accept our meeting. We're also meeting with ministers and, as far as we can, politicians and also government agencies to try to socialize this concept of an independent agency and try to get feedback about the perceived challenges. So over the next year, I think our plan is to try to meet with all the universities and get that piece of work started. We would like to quite quickly have a response to the letter within a month or two.
So you got
then,
you never.
And Heneatu, would you mute yourself? Okay, so what we have is this plan, and then once that is done, we'll continue to prosecute that program based on what we see. We'll also try to bring together, we've been trying to invite speakers like Sarah Ahmed and so on into our collective here to try to share the research on addressing sexual harassment, bullying on campus. So we will try to bring those researchers to forums like this in future so that all of us can be empowered with the knowledge of how these systems work, how they fail, and how they continue to protect perpetrators. So I think all of us have got to be armed with knowledge because we want to be an evidence-based movement. It would be a bit sad if we weren't. So that's our plan. One is to address the vice chancellors and senior managers, see what they say, see how they respond. Two is to try to push as much of knowledge as we can into as wider groups in the campuses as we can, so we're all part of the collective and we're all empowered by knowledge. So that's the sort of two strands of our strategy. Do you want to check another question? Hopefully with someone in the panel. Is there something for someone in the panel?
I'll give one to Nicola just for fun. It's not specifically directed for Nicola, but so it's clarifying that issues of bullying would be included. Would issues of bullying be included, or is it just related to sexual violence?
I mean, I think that's related to what Linda talked about, and I think that's I mean, it's included, but the actual outcomes and the actual solutions for different types of harassment will end up perhaps looking a little different, I guess. We're still at the point of figuring out how this independent body, for example, will work. And so I think, yes, in the sense that we're interested in all of these things, as Linda said, but yeah, it will be a process to go through how each of these kinds of issues are addressed. Yeah.
There's a question for Angela, or that will be for Angela, about, Angela, you mentioned casual workers or with people in insecure employment. How, Angela, do you have thoughts around how that would kind of works? And what are the panel's thoughts on action that can be taken around precarious employment? I think kind of seeing the intersection between, I guess, the power imbalance of precarious employment and how that kind of plays out in a university context. Angela?
Okay, that's a really hard question to answer, find its solutions to, I'm afraid. And it's also a really big issue in universities, and a growing problem for universities as well. And I'm not sure how to actually answer it or what solutions can be provided through, one thing I guess through our body is that, at least through doing climate surveys, and also part of one of the things that we're really looking to do is do a survey fairly soon from Shock, where we might be able to get a sense of just how much this is actually affecting people who are in precarious employment. So we can probably get a sense of the pattern and hopefully report on that fairly quickly as well. So I guess that's the best means by which we might be able to make some arguments around this, as through that evidence base, as Rhema was talking about. I'll leave it to others to maybe have a comment on precarious employment as well.
The question asker has thanked you. Also, someone has noted the gender dynamics of precarious employment as well. There's a few questions that are kind of in a similar vein around engaging with student unions and TEU and unions like that. Nicola, do you want to answer that question? I guess how do we plan on engaging with unions?
I can have a go. I mean, I think that as Rhema's said, our plan for the next few months is to keep engaging with a range of interested people. There is a slight dynamic around unions, which has been pointed out by others as well, that they can be there to support a staff member who is in any kind of difficult employment situation, and that can include perpetrators. So I think we do need to be focused on the issue and the issues facing survivors, and we absolutely can and should be talking to relevant unions, and the student unions perhaps even more so, because I think you've pointed out, Kayli, that those dynamics aren't quite the same there in terms of the support that students get in making complaints.
Yes. Sorry, I'm just trying to find more questions. There's a question about the role of both men and women and non-binary people in this group, and how we plan on, engaging people in positions of privilege who maybe haven't had the first-hand experience or heard the stories of this, and how we plan on engaging them in our kaupapa.
I mean, we have very active men in the committee now, incredibly active. So it's an issue for people who are sick of being either survivors and victims or bystanders, and most of us are sick of being bystanders. I think most of us have been bystanders. Most of us wish we had not been bystanders, and most of us are sick to death of being bystanders. So if you are in those categories, Shock is for you. It really is about being an ally for this for the system change that we want. There have been some incredibly brave and continue to be incredibly brave people in our system who are standing up and prosecuting singularly complaints and trying to grapple with the system and bring it to a reasonable and just conclusion. Unfortunately, those people are not getting the support they can, and rather we are not primarily a support system for folks who are doing that. We celebrate them and we understand how hard it is, but our role of shock is not that kind of program. The role of shock is for bystanders who want to change the system, plus survivors and victims who can tell firsthand the problems of the system. So to me, that's the what we're trying to do. And so you can see that it is incredibly wide agenda and inclusive of most of us who have been in university systems. Unfortunately, very few of us have escaped after, I can assure you, after 20 years of multiple stories, none of us have escaped being bystanders. So that's the sort of a way we're trying to address that. It is not a support group, it's a group for a systemic change.
There's a lot of questions coming in. I've combined two together. So one of them is a question about victims and survivors sharing their stories, and I guess whether there'll be a survey for that, which we've touched briefly on in the climate survey. So we plan on doing a climate survey to look at the experiences of students and staff, both their feelings about how they interact with their space, but also their experiences and lived experiences as well. So I hope that answers that question. There is a question about overseas models and whether there are overseas models that we're basing ourselves off, and also whether there are groups in other places, for example Australia, that people could get involved in from overseas. Rhema, do you have thoughts on that?
We've been contacted now recently from people overseas, which has been incredibly exciting. And Australia also has its own challenges. I don't know if Tina or Bego are on this call and could speak a little bit to what's happening in Australia in this context. Tina, are you on the call? Can you unmute yourself and maybe share what's happening? Okay, Tina might not be on the call, but we.
I am on the call. Sorry.
No worries, Tina.
I was just moving on the mobile and get out of an open space. So we don't have anything happening in particular at the moment. I'm not fully aware of what's going on. There is definitely not sort of a collective action. I know there was a report written by the Australian National University a couple of years ago, sort of an inquiry, but it's not very clear what type of actions have been taken. We were very pleased, both Begonia and I were very pleased to be asked to join your group so that we can actually get things started here. And what's very important for us to be involved as Australians is that people living in New Zealand can travel to Australia and can get a job in Australia. And it's very important for us to have a sort of to collaborate on this ground to avoid perpetrators can move between the countries without, being punished or, being known for their actions. So I think I was very happy to be involved, and I will, both Begonia and I are planning to get the conversation started here in Australia.
I might just add to that very quickly. So there are other groups internationally, of course, that have done similar things or that are doing similar things. In the UK, there's the 1752 group, and they're, one of the founders of that was Emma Chapman, and she's one of these cases of somebody who was really prevented from being able to tell her own story by an NDA that was effectively inappropriate, and she had to fight for a long time to get out of that. So there are definitely international groups that we will be talking to and that we will hopefully learn from, but that's going to be an ongoing process. Yeah.
And also
Thanks,
just If I might just follow up, there's an enormous amount of research that's been done across different countries, and we're collating that literature together to give us a better platform to understand the kind of questions that we need to ask when we do our survey. So research is there, evidence is there. We really need to be thinking about what can we do here in Aotearoa that's appropriate to the places that we are working in and learning in.
I have to say, when we discussed the survey, I know Linda was very keen on it, but my first response was, it's a survey into the bleeding obvious. So I didn't really see the point, but I've now come to conclusions that Linda reached, which very early on, which is, unless we can document and evidentiate what the challenges are in our universities, we will not be able to move forward. So please do. And I think on that note, we might turn it back to the final conclusion of this this launch. Thank you all for coming. We will be doing a survey. We've designed it. It's been developed right now. If you go to sign the letter, I think the letter has a link to the early versions of the survey. But we feel that for now we're going to push as much as we can to get support from University New Zealand and the Vice Chancellors, because without them, the chance that we will get a really population representative survey is diminished. So our first port of call is to try to convince the universities that collectively they really should come on board with such a survey, and through their ages we can get that survey sorted. If they say no, we'll still continue and we will keep doing this, but it is really a question of whether we can work with the universities to prosecute this model. And I think what we're selling to the universities is the idea that this collectively we can be so much stronger. No one wants to have bullies and perpetrators in their midst. No university wants that. They struggle with how to address it. They don't want it, but they can't address it. So I feel that together, if we find a solution, it's a win-win solution, because they'll be happy. Those of us on the call will be ecstatic, and we can all, Linda, all of us can stop, doing we'll go back to what we all love, which is our research, our students, and our teaching, and our families and our friends. So on that note, thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it. We are overwhelmed by having had 150 participants on this call. It is amazing. I might even say it's shocking, but that's fantastic. Thank you very much and have a wonderful weekend. Good night.
Good night.